listeners, and welcome back to another episode of Exploring the World with the Dot Potato Sisters.
Before we do That's Crazy, we have a surprise for you.
Yes, you are not just listening to another episode of this podcast, but the third episode of our
Drum roll, please.
new Arctic season.
We hope you enjoyed this episode.
Now, for That's Crazy fact.
Okay, listeners, how do you think monkeys say hello to each other?
With a wave or something?
This deserves a dun-dun-dun moment.
Dun, dun, dun! According to National Geographic Kids, white-faced capuchin monkeys greet each other by sticking their fingers in each other's noses.
Okay, first of all, ew. Second of all, why?
Well, scientists believe that these monkeys do this so they know whether they can be trusted or not. It is also a mark of dominance for the males.
Wow, that was supremely gross. So, diving into the Arctic,
Listeners, we also have a guest in this episode.
please welcome Ms.Alysa from Polar Bears International. She will give us some more information on the Arctic and introduce herself now.
So for our first question, for our listeners, could you please tell us your name and title?
Sure. Hi, I'm Ms.Alysa McCall, and I'm the Director of Conservation Outreach and a staff scientist at Polar Bears International.
How does a typical day look like for you?
Oh, my typical day can look pretty different depending on the season. A lot of my days, especially, through the depths of winter, I'm at my computer every day. I'm sending emails and I'm on Zoom meetings and I'm managing spreadsheets and writing grants and just kind of like managing things. I sometimes get to do fun things like this where I talk to young people, classrooms around the world. That's kind of one of my favorite things to do. At other times of the year, for example, I'm heading up to Churchill, Manitoba pretty soon because it's polar bear season. So at that time of the year, my day looks like I get up really early. Sometimes I wake up on a tundra buggy and I'm out on the tundra and I look out the window and there's a polar bear right next to me. And then I get to spend all day kind of slowly driving around, looking at polar bears, also doing kind of live events where I talk to people around the world and get to show them polar bears. And then at night, I'm speaking with tourists, maybe giving a presentation and having dinner with people that are visiting. So those are kind of like the fun times when I actually get to go visit polar bears in the field. A lot of times I'm in my office, and that's okay too. I've been working with polar bears for 15 years now, so I've collected things.
Could you tell us like some of the projects you are working on? And do you track polar bears coming to the Hudson Bay? Could you tell us more about the migrations these bears do to the Hudson Bay? And then is there any like correlation between the Hudson Bay polar bears and the Svalbard polar bears?
Sure. So we work on quite a few different types of research projects. We do our own research and we fund a lot of other research. So we support various projects that are working with Indigenous knowledge of polar bears, which is really important. So the people and the cultures that live with polar bears, making sure we're understanding their knowledge, supporting them, supporting coexistence with polar bears. So as polar bears spend more time on land, they're getting hungrier, maybe more likely to get into garbage and things like that, supporting the people that live with the bears and while trying to keep polar bears in the wild and making sure they're not getting killed by wandering into communities all the time. Genetics is a huge rising area of work we're supporting, as well as different field research. And then, of course, tracking, as you mentioned, is super important. So tracking is actually one of the most important areas of research for polar bears because of what I mentioned. Because they spend most of their lives so far away from people, we would have no idea what they're doing for most of the year without tracking. It's really been thanks to GPS technology that we can understand where polar bears move, how big their home ranges are, how they might change their movements based on sea ice patterns, what type of sea ice they need, all those sorts of things really only comes from that data. So we do support the tracking of polar bears in different ways. In Canada, it is the federal government that mostly manages the collaring and tracking of polar bears along with the University of Alberta. And then there's also some out of Ontario as well. Ontario Ministry of Natural Resources put some collars out. So those collars are put on Hudson Bay polar bears, and the Hudson Bay polar bears kind of stay in Hudson Bay. We can call it migration in a sense. that they're out on the sea ice in Hudson Bay during the winter. They come back onto land during the summer when the ice melts. But generally, the bears in Hudson Bay stay in Hudson Bay. There's three populations in Hudson Bay. So polar bears are interesting. There's 20 populations across their range. Generally, those polar bears stay within their populations, though there might be some gene flow and movements between. And then depending on where we look, the home ranges are really different sizes. So there's an area of Hudson Bay called James Bay. It's like the little offshoot of Hudson Bay. And some polar bears born in James Bay will like never leave James Bay hardly. They have the smallest home ranges. They just hang out amongst this little area and they have enough food and they're fine and they barely move. And then we have bears in Svalbard, like you mentioned, Svalbard, Norway, and they have some of the biggest home ranges of any mammal in the world. And they're 500,000 square kilometers, like bigger than the size of some states or even Canadian provinces, maybe some of the smaller
Yeah.
ones. Huge. They're roaming massive areas to find food. So by tracking these polar bears in different areas that have really different sea ice patterns and amounts of prey, we can say like, oh wow, these polar bears move differently than these ones. But they're never like we're never going to see a Svalbard polar bear like wander into Hudson Bay or vice versa. But they do have similarities and differences that tracking technology can really help with. And we support that work financially. We also developed with 3M, who's the Post-it note company. We worked with them to make a fur tag that would like just get tangled in the fur of a polar bear in its shoulder. So we can only collar adult females, but so we're missing cubs and we're missing males and all these other bears. So the fur tags allow us to track any polar bear, but they only last a few months. So it's a bit of a trade-off, and we're still working on getting more of those out there.
So why could you only track like female polar bears?
Yeah, so little cubs are growing, so we don't want to collar them while they grow.
Yeah.
And male polar bears have super thick necks compared to their heads. They have like pylon heads. So if we collar them, they can just like pull the collar right off. Whereas a female has a more slender neck, so it can kind of stay. She can still pull it off, and they do pull them off if they really want to. But generally, the collars only really stay on the females, and the males get them off right away.
For our first episode, we're going to talk mostly about polar bears.
Cool.
The polar bear's scientific name is Ursus maritimus. This means maritime bear. The polar bear is also the largest predator on land. And fun fact, the polar bear has 74 chromosomes, or think of it as 37 chromosome pairs. And to give you listeners some context, humans have 26 pairs, or 46 chromosomes. Scientists don't exactly know the significance of this yet. So it will be interesting to see where this genetic research goes over the upcoming years.
Which brings me to ask,
And how different are the gene pools of the bears in like southeastern like Greenland compared to the Canadian polar bears?
They are pretty similar. So for polar bears, like there's no subspecies or anything. It's all the same species. Even if when we see grizzly bears, there's like subspecies. So polar bears right now are all kind of looked at the same. This might change as we learn more about genetics. The polar bear genetics world has just exploded in the last 5 to 10 years, which is super exciting. We can tell from some genetic work that some polar bear populations are like more adaptable than others. They've got some more resiliency in their genes, so it means like they're more able to kind of change or like adapt to changing conditions. We know the Hudson Bay bears are they're quite adaptable, but they're almost at the limit of their adaptability right now. Like we've pushed them pretty far. The southern Greenland bears are really interesting. Like they're still the newest subpopulation of polar bears. We've only even like had that population for the last year or two, and those bears are the ones for your listeners who are hunting seals on glaciers. So they're like the small pocket of bear. They're still using ice to hunt seals, but it's kind of a glacier ice system instead. So it is a little bit different. Ultimately, they're still polar bears. They're not a subspecies, but they've kind of learned and mated differently. Like within their kind of group, so they look maybe a little different genetically. Visually, polar bears generally look quite the same as well. We see with like brown and black bears in some pockets there might be different color morphs, and you can kind of tell their faces apart. Polar bears are pretty consistently one type of bear, although I have heard anecdotally that there's a group of bears up in the Norwegian Bay Area of Canada that have been called weasel bears by locals. I think they've got more of like a long face, like a weaselly looking face. I don't know though, but it's interesting to think that there's these pockets of gene flow where, depending on how the bears are mating, they might end up looking different. So yeah, the gene flow and all the genetic stuff is so interesting. Researchers are currently working on the entire like genetic map of polar bears across the Arctic and trying to road map all the bears and who's mated with who. And it's just so fascinating. It's very, very cool.
You said that the bears, they are now kind of using glaciers to hunt the seals. But I've also read that now that the glaciers are really melting faster. How does this impact the way the polar bears are like hunting the seals?
Right. So it's super rare for polar bears to use glaciers to hunt seals. It's really the only place we know that they do that consistently would be in that area. There might be some bears that are doing something similar in Svalbard, which has a lot of glaciers, but we haven't seen that like kind of come out in the data. But you're right, glaciers are definitely being impacted by a warming world. So in southern Greenland, if we continue to lose glaciers, then those polar bears will continue to lose access to their prey, just as polar bears that are using sea ice to hunt seals are losing access to their seal prey too. So when it kind of came out that hey, these Greenland polar bears, they're doing something different, I think some people or maybe the media can kind of think like, oh, they're saved or there's like a new option. But like everything's still warming and it's still ice. So if we're losing the ice, the polar bears are losing their habitat. So it is good to keep in mind.
Could you tell me more about like how the polar bears don't overheat? Because like we know that they like jump into the water to cool off and they have nose and ear holes that somehow like filter the air to cool them off. But how do they control like blood cells and their muscle tissue as well? And how has this evolved over time?
Yeah, that's an interesting question. I don't know if we're able to get into such kind of fine detail about how they don't overheat. They do overheat sometimes. So,
Oh,
for example, well, so in most of their range, they don't have to worry about overheating. They stay cool. Even historically, the summer was pretty cool in most places. Now there are definitely places, like particularly around Hudson Bay, where the summers can be in the 20s or 30s Celsius. So the
wow.
bears would be quite warm. And in that case, they're doing almost no activity. And what we see them do is kind of pancake or starfish. So they'll like lay on their stomach with their arms out, or I guess they could be on their back, but they try to expose their armpits. It's a place where they can cool down. Same with humans too. There's so much blood flow in kind of these areas that kind of helps the heat escape. So we'll see them be super lazy, seek out shade, seek out ponds, get in water, try to cool down. We also do research on polar bears in these areas in the fall. So, for example, in Churchill, Manitoba, every September, late August, September, researchers go out to research the bears. If it's too warm on those days, and that could even be if it's like plus 10 or plus 15, like if it's too warm, they're not going to go out at all. You're not going to chase a polar bear. You're not going to stress a polar bear out if it's too warm because it could overheat and die. And nobody wants that. So they really are a cold adapted bear. We do see them in zoos, right? Sometimes like in warm places. Generally, the zoos that have healthy polar bears in warm climates are zoos that have cold pools, that have shade, that give the polar bears ice buckets, and that are really conscious of keeping the bears very cool even when it's warm outside. So it's definitely a concern.
So like I guess like a question about the zoos. Can are they like allowed to thin polar bear fur?
Allowed to thin it? I don't think so. I don't think a zoo would do that. I do think one interesting thing they could look at though is like the zoo bears are fed quite a different diet. So generally, a wild polar bear that's eating mostly blubber, like that sort of fat and that high energy content is going to help that bear be really healthy, have a thick layer of body fat, have like grow thick, lustrous fur, just like when we're eating really well and like good omega-3s or whatever, our hair looks good and all this. Polar bears in a zoo are going to eat slightly different, so hopefully they still have a high fat content and like their kibble, or maybe they get a lot of fish or something. Again, zoos have to watch the protein levels, but they're not eating the high blubber So their fur might not be like quite as oily or thick or something. But yeah, the zoos are not going to thin the bear's fur, but they're just going to really try to take good care of that bear to keep it cool and happy even when it's warm. And we do see happy polar bears in those climates that are well taken care of, that are doing okay and doing great even. Yeah.
Mm, um, so we've seen videos where polar bears were like playing with some of the sledge dogs. Um,
Mm.
is this a common interaction?
No. So that is from Churchill, Manitoba, those pictures. That sort of situation doesn't really tend to happen anymore. It was kind of one person who had some sled dogs out on the coast and would feed them, and the bears would smell that food and come in. Um, if the bears were really like happy and well fed and fine, then yeah, they might interact nicely with those dogs. They didn't always interact nicely with those dogs, but pictures of that aren't really online very much.
Yeah.
So it's not something we would really like promote or be like, oh, polar bears love dogs or anything like that. But again, a happy, well-fed polar bear is a pretty, I guess maybe a little more friendly than like a grizzly bear or something. So they definitely had some nice looking interactions. And there are some pretty cute pictures online. That's true.
We heard like polar bears can store their sperm until they're ready to get pregnant. Could you go further into like the science part of this process? How long can they store the sperm for?
So I think for this, I think what that source probably meant was that polar bears have delayed implantation.
Yeah.
So polar bears will, so the females and males, they'll mate in the spring, and ideally an egg or two gets fertilized by the sperm and becomes a zygote. And the zygote is when, yeah, you have like very early stages, the sperm and the egg hanging out there. Usually what happens in like humans and other animals, it is that zygote implants right away and starts growing a baby. But in polar bears, it just hangs out and it can float around. And it's unique in that is she pregnant? Is she not pregnant? It's one of the few examples of like, we don't know. And then months later, so the female will need to gain a ton of weight. So she does have some hormone changes. She will eat as much as she can. She'll gain hundreds of pounds of body fat. Like these pregnant females get so fat. And it's only then in the fall, summer, fall-ish time. I don't know if we know exactly when, but there's cues where her body will kind of say, okay, am I fat enough to sustain this pregnancy? And if she's not, then that zygote will just flush out. And if she is, then it will implant. And then she will go into a den to then grow those babies or baby, give birth, nurse, and then come out. So they do have kind of this delayed system, and it's all really based on how healthy and fat the female is. The smallest female we know of in the wild that gave birth successfully was 420 pounds. I think anything below that is probably not viable, but often these females are like 600 pounds or more. They really want that extra body fat because when they go into the den and give birth and nurse and everything, they're not eating for up to about 8 months. So they need to be so fat before that and live off that body fat for months before they can go eat again.
We read that polar bears have started eating caribou and seaweed in and around like Canada and Svalbardish areas. Could you tell us more about how this is like affecting or like evolving their intestines?
Sure. So polar bears evolved from the brown bear, and part of that split was that polar bears had some genetic adaptations to eat mostly fat in the form of seal blubber, and that's really their main food. And the food that is the healthiest for them is this blubber. And we can talk about that later. They've got these kind of special adaptations, but polar bears are still bears and they're still hungry all the time and they don't always have access to seal blubber. So they absolutely will eat different foods that they come across, and they will have always have done this across their evolutionary history. And some of the foods that are available in the Arctic include things like seaweed and reindeer or caribou. And we have seen polar bears eating those. And they might eat those foods more often. As they lose sea ice, they lose access to seal blubber, so they might eat more of these other types of foods that aren't quite as good for them, but it still, feels good to eat. When we're hungry, we don't always have access to like the perfect balanced meal, right? We might eat some like jelly beans or something, and it just kind of helps us feel good. Same with polar bears. So we do see them particularly near Churchill at this time of the year. All the bears are on the coast. We see them eating a lot of seafood. We call it like a polar bear salad sometimes. We've been wondering if maybe there's some micronutrients in there. Like hopefully they're getting some vitamins or minerals. We don't know. As for the reindeer, the Svalbard example is particularly interesting because they have been documented hunting reindeer more often than they used to. And this is interesting. And those reindeer are fattier than like the caribou in Canada. So they do have more fat, which is good for the polar bears. At the same time, it costs the polar bear a lot of energy to hunt a reindeer, and reindeers are high in protein. And we do know from zoo studies that too much protein over too long a period can actually hurt polar bears' kidneys and make them less healthy. They really are like a fat adapted bear. Yeah, they are quite different from brown bears in that way. So we're keeping our eye on it. Calories are good. Some fat is good. Food is good. But over time, we'll see what happens. And we do know that there are just not enough calories on land to sustain populations of polar bears long term. Like ultimately, they really do need to be out on that sea ice hunting seals for a good chunk of the year. So it's being monitored. It's a very interesting question. Yeah.
Thank you.
Cute.
Polar bears are also mammals, and they can live for up to 25 to 30 years in the wild. They are about 10 feet tall when they are standing on their hind legs.
The polar bear is a carnivore and it commonly weighs 900 to 1,600 pounds.
Even though polar bears are born on land, they'll spend most of their time in the water.
Wait, where do polar bears live though?
Polar bears live, and I quote from Polar Bears International's article titled Habitat, open quote, polar bears are forever linked to the Arctic sea ice where they hunt their seal prey. The bears are found in 5 range states: the US, Alaska, Canada, Russia, Greenland, and Norway, Svalbard. Scientists have divided them into 20 populations, some of which are shared by more than one country. Close quote.
My favorite thing about polar bears is about their paws. According to WWF's article titled Paws and Claws, Polar Bear Foundations, the polar bear's paws are built to be heavily furred for warmth, and the pads on their paws are rough for traction on the ice. But another reason why polar bears' paws are so fascinating is because of how big they are.
Yes, a polar bear's paw is very big. According to WWF's article titled Paws and Claws, Polar Bear Foundations, the paws are usually about 12 inches wide.
Having big paws is important to polar bears.
Why?
Well, this helps them spread their weight so they don't fall through the ice or slip.
It is not just the paws that help polar bears to survive, but also their claws.
The claws help grip the sea ice and grab their prey, such as seals. Compared to brown bears, they are actually shorter but much sharper, almost 4 inches long.
Their paws of a polar bear also help them swim because they are slightly webbed. Did you know that some polar bears have been recorded to be able to swim hundreds of miles from land?
That is so cool.
I know, right? I wish I could do that.
Let's talk about the life cycle of polar bears.
Okay, so polar bear mating season is in spring, between April and late June.
According to the Polar Bears International's article titled Life Cycle, male polar bears will search for females on the sea ice by following scent trails that are left by footpads.
Yes, and males and females normally mate on sea ice, but the fertile eggs won't implant until fall. Also, mating will only work if the female has enough fat to sustain her and her cubs during the denning period.
The process that Ria has just explained is called delayed implantation.
After the male is done mating with the female, he will stay with her for a few days before taking off by himself.
Once the female has gained as much weight as possible, she will enter her maternity den to give birth to her cubs.
To build this den, she will dig a small cave in a snowdrift, large enough for her to only turn around.
After, she waits for the snow to close up the den and hide it.
Polar bear cubs are usually born in December. Their mother can give birth to 1 to 3 cubs, which are often twins.
The mother and her cubs will remain in their dens until spring. In the den, the mother will not eat or drink anything.
Wow. That's crazy. When born, though, the cubs are blind and toothless. This makes them rely completely on their mother.
These cubs will weigh a little over 1 lb and are 30 to 35 centimeters long, or 12 to 14 inches.
Because the cubs are toothless, they will drink their mother's rich milk, who will be continuing to nurse them for 20 months.
That's right, Ria. The polar bear cubs will usually emerge from their dens around March and April, when they're strong enough to survive in the harsh Arctic conditions and make the long hike to the sea ice.
Once the cubs have emerged from the den, though, their mother will start to also teach them important lessons on how to hunt and survive. Polar bear cubs are also encouraged to play with each other because, although it looks useless to an outsider eye, this is actually really helpful for the polar bears to develop skills such as fighting and how to assert dominance.
Another cool thing about polar bears is that their cousins are the brown bears.
But unlike the brown bears, polar bears usually share their food.
What do you mean?
Well, after a polar bear kills their prey and there's another polar bear walking by, the walking polar bear will sometimes stop and ask if it can share the kill. Ms.Alysa will share more on that.
We read that, the polar bears sometimes they share the food they hunt with other polar bears, but now that the ice is melting and food is getting a bit harder to find for them, have they kind of stopped sharing food? Are they doing it less?
Are they shifting social dynamics?
That is a really interesting question and one I wish we knew more about. Polar bears are so hard to study because for most of their life, they're out on the sea ice in conditions that are so dangerous for humans. They're in the dark, the cold, on chunks of ice in the ocean. So we really have very limited opportunities to observe their social dynamics and see how those change over time. So we would love to know more about it. We don't know a ton, but you are right. More than many other bear species, probably arguably, polar bears do seem to be more willing to share their food. And there was just an example I heard. Some researchers just last month saw a seal kill on the coast of Ontario, and there were 6 adult males on it. Just for a grizzly bear, they would be not happy about that situation. But grizzly bears are quite territorial. Polar bears are not territorial because they live out on the sea ice. You can't really defend a hunk of ice because it's always shifting and moving.
Yeah.
Part of it that they're not territorial, they're more willing to share. And then in Churchill, at this time of the year in the fall, where there's not a lot of food, it's not mating season, nothing, we do see polar bears hanging out and playing together. And that's also not really a regular thing. So polar bears might be more of a social bear. And as they lose access to their food, that could change, it would be interesting to see a well-fed polar bear versus a starving polar bear. The starving polar bear might be more aggressive or more likely to not want to share its food. But as a broad statement across our polar bear social dynamics changing, we wouldn't be able to say that at this point, but it's very interesting to think about.
For the fur tags, have you been putting them, are you trying them on the females first? Because they're the ones who don't really pull off their collars, or the males?
It's a good question. We put them on both. We tested them first with zoo bears who can teach us so much about polar bears in a way that we can't learn from wild bears. And then I actually think I would have to go back and look. I think we did put a couple on females so that we could compare the collar data with the fur tag data and make sure it was looking good. And then some did go out on the males to get some male data because we are so lacking in male data. So a good amount went out on the males as well. The technology is currently in the hands of the guys who created the tags, and we're hoping that they can get it out to more mass market. But I don't know if any went out I don't think any went out this last fall, but hopefully we see more in the future.
How did the tubes in their fur scatter light evolve to be that way? Because I've also read that the fur just it scatters light, the UV light, and it's really interesting.
Yeah, so the fur is such an interesting question. There is a lot of old information out there about fiber optic UV light stuff, and that's pretty. We know now that that's outdated and that's not quite true. But you're right that the fur is hollow, So it almost looks like it has little tubes in it. And it does scatter light because just the nature of it being clear and hollow scatters light and makes it look white to our eyes, even though they have clear fur. So it really is very interesting fur and very well suited for the Arctic environment. There is a team right now who just got a big grant in the United States, and they've started working on it this year. I think it's a 3-year grant out of maybe Tennessee, but they're looking at the origins of polar bear fur and asking that exact question you asked, like why has the fur and how has it evolved this way from the brown bear ancestor? So hopefully I'll have a better answer to your question in a couple of years because it is a fascinating topic, and there's a lot we don't know about like how it actually came about. Clearly it benefited them and they've adapted and evolved to have this kind of fur structure, and it would have come from the brown bear ancestor. So I'll follow up with you in a couple of years and we'll talk more.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Um, like kind of like a follow-up question. Do you think like polar bears might start like reverse like evolving as in like maybe they'll like react in like their bodies will like evolve in a different way now that it's getting warmer, so they'll lose some of their like I don't know, their like systems of keeping warm.
Yeah, if so, the thing about polar bears, one of the things, is that they live a long time and reproduce very slowly. And those are things that mean that evolution is very slow and adaptation is very slow. And at the rate of warming of our world currently, polar bears can't keep up. It is, it is possible if we gave them like a ton of time that maybe we could see some changes. But we right now don't think that their bodies at a fundamental level will change in time. So, for example, like we're really looking at the next 20 to 40 years. Well, what year is it now? Or like into 2100, maybe. So, like, let's say for the next 80 years, really looking at massive changes happening in the Arctic. And for polar bears, that is, not that many generations of babies. So it's not enough time to really fully adapt physically, biologically. They're very smart bears. They can do some behavioral adaptation for sure.
Mm.
Out different ways to hunt, different ways to access food. They're very smart and resilient in a lot of ways. But some of their slow reproduction makes them quite vulnerable because their genes just can't change enough in time and have it stick in this like wide-ranging population. It's tough.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And we read in a 2021 article published on Polar Bears International that scientists still don't know why polar bears have such different skin colors from pink, brown, and black, but this may be because it's an advantage for staying warm or protecting them from UV rays. Has this hypothesis been developed?
So there was some testing done. So actually, it was the Columbia Sportswear team. Like Columbia jackets, the brand. So they worked with a different polar bear scientist, maybe last year, maybe it was 2 years ago. But they were looking at developing a better winter jacket based on polar bear fur, which is kind of cool. I just kind of heard like the end of it. But as part of their research, they did kind of test whether the black skin could potentially absorb more heat. And is that why they have black skin a lot of times? They did learn some cool stuff about the fur. I think I can track that down if you're interested. But their initial look at it seemed to suggest that the black skin didn't necessarily help them absorb more
Oh,
heat. And that maybe, sorry, it was kind of like just left over from the brown bear or something. I would say we're still not sure. I don't think it hurts them at all. I definitely don't think it hurts that black skin in the Arctic. I think, yeah, for UV protection and warmth, like not a bad thing. But I don't think we're ready to say like this is why this is this way yet.
We read that polar bears and grizzly bears are like mating. So, how has the development between the Pisleys and Grolars further enhanced their evolutionary traits? And how does this influence their genetics?
So polar bears split from the brown bear hundreds of thousands of years ago, but they're still close cousins and they can still mate. They probably have always mated occasionally throughout their history together. Um, but it was really in recent years that this kind of became a big topic because there were some photos published and some genetics were done about this one situation. And people really kind of ran with this idea of the growler bear because it's just like super fun to say and it's so interesting. But the genetics were run on everything we knew, and then the story emerged that was pretty fascinating. So it turns out that what we know right now is that this was quite an isolated event, which I think any kind of matings would be. There was one female polar bear in the high Canadian Arctic, and in her lifetime, she mated with two different brown bear males. We don't know if she had a preference or if that was the only option she had. Uh,
Yeah.
Usually during mating season, the species are quite separated. The brown bears would be on land, the polar bears are out on the ice. So she was overlapping with these brown bear guys for whatever reason. She then gave birth to two different litters of half and half brown bear, polar bear. And then
Mhm.
had at least one offspring who went on to mate again with the same set of brown bear males, so at least one of the brown bear males,
Oh,
and had a three-quarter brown, one-quarter polar bear offspring. So first of all, it's interesting that the hybrids were fertile. Sometimes when we see species mate, the resulting hybrid is not fertile, cannot have babies, but
yeah.
bears are so closely related they can still have babies. So yeah, then the next question is, wow, is this like a super bear? Is this going to be
Yeah.
the future of bears? Like just mix them. This will kind of save polar bear genetics, like mix them with brown bears, all be good. Well, it turns out, like polar bears are specialists for sea ice. They are highly specialized and evolved for sea ice. Brown bears are super generalists on land. They are such land bears. So when you mix these together, you get a bear that doesn't really belong anywhere and that isn't really happy. Anecdotally, this was a very angry hybrid, like really grumpy. And then they look kind of weird. So it was kind of like this creamy colored bear with these dark circles around its eyes. I guess its feet were kind of a mix between polar bear and brown bear feet. Like polar bears have really furred feet. Brown bears have like not much fur on their feet. They've got different claws, things like that. And this bear was kind of a mix. This bear was also, the hybrids were raised by a polar bear mom, but then it seems like when they were weaned, they came back and tried to live on land and might not have known what they were doing very well. So overall, the hybrids just weren't a good fit. Not a great bear. As far as we know, they were all removed from the population in one way or another. There were some stories about them being like highly aggressive toward people. So yeah, so that was that. That kind of story wrapped up. All the genetics were done on all the bears we knew of, the moms, the dads, the babies, all that, and kind of just told this one little story. Right now, anecdotally, I've heard that there might be another hybrid out there. Sometimes people see a really dirty polar bear and think it's a brown bear, but people that live in the north and really understand bear morphology, I have heard that maybe there's another one out there, which doesn't surprise me. I think we'll see more. I don't think we're gonna see like all of a sudden a ton of growler bears show up. It's not going to be a bear that like takes over the world or saves polar bears, but it is interesting. I will also say we tend to say growler bear because usually with hybrids we say the dad first, and in the cases that we know of, it was a grizzly bear dad, polar bear mom. But I believe maybe in the zoo world there's even been a Pisley before, but again, just not a bear that's maybe really well adapted for its world.
Is like a Pisley then the wrong kind of like term to use?
It's not necessarily wrong. A Pisley would be more like a polar bear dad, a grizzly bear mom.
Okay.
But honestly, like no one's gonna. It's not a big deal to say. Some people just prefer the word Pisley, and I get it. So that I know what you mean. That's fine. Like it's not a strict rule.
Yeah.
I tend to use growler. Yeah.
Do you want to ask? Okay.
Why was sorry? Why was the split between brown and polar bear significant?
Yeah, well, I would say it's significant because it made a new species. Which is pretty cool. We still, there's still more for us to learn about that split and what caused it. We believe there was a group of brown bears, probably off the coast of Alaska, and some of the brown bears had, a lighter fur, which we see in the brown and black bear world. Sometimes they get this lighter fur color. And then those bears learned to take advantage of kind of the sea ice habitat and getting like this crazy amount of calories out on the ice, and that They would have split over time from the brown bears. So it's pretty cool to think about how they would have evolved and then kind of spread across the Arctic like that. But there's still a lot we don't know. And, polar bear fossils are really hard to find because a lot of them are at the bottom of the ocean. So we don't have a ton of polar bear fossils. They
Yeah.
often die out on the ice and then we don't see their bodies or anything. So there's more for us to learn about that split. But in the next 5, 10 years, we'll probably know a lot more.
Wow.
We read that the ice supports algae in the Arctic. What is happening to all the algae when the ice is melting?
Yeah, that's a great question. We know that for polar bears, 86% of the carbon in polar bear bodies is from sea ice algae. So polar bears are really built on algae. So algae is so important. They are the primary producers of the Arctic. We like to say that Arctic sea ice is to the ocean what soil is to the forest. So the algae are really the plants that are forming the base of the food chain for the Arctic and supporting the entire food web, the small creatures, the fish, the seals, the whales, the polar bears, and the people that live in the north too. So you're right, as we lose sea ice, we're losing these primary producers. And it remains to be seen how impactful this is. We do know that we're seeing um, we call it Atlantification of some areas of the Arctic already. So as we lose these cold temperatures and like the sea ice algae in this food web, it's basically like the Atlantic Ocean is expanding into the Arctic, and these other species are moving up. And then this Arctic food web is shrinking. And part of that would have to do with the algae. And this algae also, like these plants are so important just for our atmosphere, for oxygen production, for the stability of Earth as we know it. So losing ice algae and ocean algae is not good for people either. We also like to say on the flip side, like sea ice is the Earth's air conditioner. Having sea ice helps cool our whole planet down. It reflects sunlight away from Earth. It cools us down. And then having the algae there is really helping regulate. The Arctic is regulating everything for us. Like it's good for humans. It's good for polar bears. It's good for everyone. We want to work to keep it up there. So yeah, I actually really love it when people think about the algae because, it's not as cool as the polar bear, but it's arguably more important for the world in a lot of ways.
Yeah.
In 2007, we read that the Northwest Passage remained ice-free for the first time in recorded history. And as more changes are happening now, how is this affecting the growth of the plankton and the algae? And if it is impacting them, how is it impacting the rest of the ecosystem?
Yeah. I think for the Northwest Passage, I don't know if we would be able to quantify. I might have to talk to my algae friend. I don't know if we'd be able to quantify okay, if we lose this amount of ice, how much algae is that and how much does that to matter to the atmosphere and to the world? And I'm sure it's an amount. Since 2007, of course, we've lost more ice in the Arctic, and these shipping routes are really opening up. And so it is a concern. And right now, there's also talks about more shipping routes in Hudson Bay, which is a concern in a lot of ways. And, economic development is important, and we can't take that away from people. But we do have to consider how it affects the ice and the algae and the bears and the whales with the noise. And then with shipping, actually, one of our biggest concerns with shipping is a potential oil spill, because we know in the Arctic, it would be so hard to contain an oil spill. And there's really very few plans to for if there's an oil spill, what do we do? There's not really great plans in place. And we know from studies in the 80s that if polar bears get oil on their fur or lick oil or anything, they are probably going to die. And then for the algae itself, just I'm sure wouldn't recover. So yeah, it's a complicated question to think about, Northwest Passage and losing ice, but then you're adding shipping and all these other things.
Yeah.
So I don't know. I'm probably not speaking to algae very well, but it's a good thing to think about because we're going to see more and more shipping in the Arctic in the coming decades. Absolutely. And what does that mean for all these things?
Isha, did you know Polar Bear International also talks about belugas too? Listeners, in the next interview clipping, you will learn a little bit about belugas amongst the midst of learning about polar bears, and we hope you enjoyed this next interview clip that we added as an extra bonus to this episode.
So we read on your website that belugas need sea ice for feeding and taking covers from predators. So now that the sea ice is melting, like how are the belugas reacting to this?
Yeah, luckily, I think generally the belugas as at a population level are still doing okay because there's a lot of them. But you're right, they are very much tied to the sea ice. We are seeing killer whales come into the Arctic more now with open water, and killer whales are predating on beluga. So that sucks for the beluga whales. All of a sudden, they have a predator underwater, which is new for them. And then, as you mentioned, like with the algae affecting the food web and everything, that can absolutely affect belugas. We also know that the fish structure in the Arctic can shift depending on what's going on with the ice and the food web. Polar cod or Arctic cod are kind of the main fish species, but we could see a shift to other species that might not fit the nutritional profile that beluga need quite as much. And again, with more shipping and that and noise underwater, belugas are so vocal. So all these things can be affecting them absolutely in the future. So we're lucky to work with some great beluga researchers, particularly in the Churchill area. But I don't know too much more about them for now, but they are definitely a sea ice species that needs that ice to persist.
That's really exciting.
So I read that on your website though. It's good for the beluga whales that they don't have a dorsal fin. But orcas, which are one of their predators, they do, so they can risk having their like back appendage, if I'm not wrong, getting torn, I think. So, but in the ice, if they try and chase after the beluga whales, so once again, now that the ice is like warming up, and the beluga whales are just and the beluga whales have less ice to hide in. Um, are the orcas taking advantage of this?
It seems like, yeah. It does seem like the orcas are coming into the Arctic more now that it's more open. You're right, they'll avoid sea ice areas, and the belugas will, so they'll migrate. So in the winter, hopefully they're nice up tucked against the ice. But one example is in Hudson Bay, where historically did not have killer whales. And now they're being spotted in Hudson Bay in the summer when the belugas migrate into Hudson Bay in the summer to have their babies and take care of their babies and everything. And now they have a predator there, which they never used to have. So luckily, it's still a relatively small number of killer whales for a relatively large number of beluga whales, but it's absolutely a concern for them. And I was lucky enough to be in Churchill one year when that happened. There were killer whales in the bay. And what we usually see in the Churchill River is, there's hundreds of whales that spread out throughout the river. And some are go into Hudson Bay in the estuary, and some are up the river and they're swimming and playing. It's very cute and nice. But that day, when the killer whales were there, like all the belugas in the area shoved up the river because killer whales also can't swim where it's too shallow, whereas belugas can get pretty shallow. So all these belugas, like thousands of belugas packed up the river, and the river just looked white. I got to go up in a helicopter and look over top. And it looked like you would be able to walk if you had to. They were packed up trying to stay away from these killer whales. So they absolutely are impacted by the predator, not at a level yet that I think would harm their population. But, it's as a concern that all of a sudden they have this new predator, and like that's no fun for any species.
Yeah.
So, yeah.
But polar bears are now in danger, as well as many other animal species because of climate change.
I quote from WWF's article titled Climate Change, open quote, the Arctic's average temperature has already risen at a rate of 3 times of the global average, warming faster than any other region on Earth, while also trying to cope with the impacts from a growing global rush for resources, new shipping routes, and opportunities. Oh, close quote.
The ice that the polar bears used to hunt is also disappearing. It is now harder for them to get close to seals without being seen, and they also have to kill them. Melting ice also raises sea level.
Because it is harder to hunt seals, polar bears have actually been seen eating kelp and hunting caribou to eat. As Miss Alyssa said in her interview clipping that we added previously.
Seals are very important for the polar bears to eat because of how many calories they have, which helps the polar bear to build their fat reserves. But with eating other food, they're not able to gain as much weight and build their fat reserves.
But listeners, you guys can help too.
Are people predicting that the Northwest Passage will remain ice free again? Like, will there be another time where it will be? Because of all the ice that's melting so quickly now.
Probably if we keep going on our current path, then we could continue to lose a lot of Arctic sea ice, and we will continue to. And we could have ice-free summers at a certain point this century. Absolutely. Um, so that is a concern. And so that's part of why we're pushing so hard now for policy changes, for leaders to care about climate change and carbon, for us to be moving in a direction that's good for humans. And that means kind of protecting ice and all these other things. And that's one reason polar bears make a great kind of ambassador species is that for to protect polar bears, we need to protect ice, but then protecting ice is good for all of us in our future too.
Yeah.
It is a concern. The more we do now, though, the better we'll be in the future. It's not black or white. I think sometimes people just want to give up, like, oh, it's too late. And like that doesn't help. Because if the more we do now, yeah, we're not perfect. If we'd started 20 years ago, that would have been better. But if we're doing more now, then we're going to end up in a better place in the future. So we got to keep pushing.
What policy changes are you trying to work on now?
Yeah, well, there's so a couple levels of policy. There's some that are just polar bear specific.
Mhm.
So we want, better waste management policies at a local level, sort of thing. And for example, the Arctic National Wildlife Refuge in Alaska, we want better policies around protecting denning moms and cubs. So we don't want oil drilling around those areas, those sorts of things. On a bigger picture, we need climate change policies. We need governments at all levels of city, provincial, state, federal to really have good climate change policies that are working to shift to cleaner energy sources like wind and solar, shift to cleaner vehicles, make clean energy more accessible so people can afford it and use it. Like I want solar panels, I can't quite afford it yet. So hopefully it'll get there, and then put the onus on these big industrial carbon emitters. Like take all this pressure, all the individual consumers who have so much stress going on. Like it's really not them, it's these big industrial companies and organizations like these oil companies that are like, they should be paying for this. So let's like give them incentives or penalties to invest in cleaner energy sources and move in that direction.
And then like what conservation efforts can kids like us do?
Yeah, kids have so much power, truly. One of the best things kids can do is talk about it. So I think your podcast is like a beautiful example of things, of just like talking about, conservation and what you care about and what you love. It doesn't have to be like climate change specific or polar bear specific, but just saying like, hey, the world is very cool. You all deserve a stable, sustainable future, and the adult should be helping you protect the future for yourselves and for your kids and your grandkids, or all these generations. We need to be thinking ahead. And so speaking up, talking to your friends about what you care about, talking to your parents, your school. As you grow up, you have so much power because you're so young. You have millions of choices that you're going to make ahead of you. So making as many choices as you can that contribute to a better future for yourselves is also really powerful. And that can be where you spend your money, who you're voting for when you're voting age, and becoming leaders too. Maybe you want to be the next president or prime minister or whoever, or mayor or city council, like anything. Make decisions to better the future is amazing.
Yeah.
So do you have any last words for our listeners?
Yeah, I would just say, well, first of all, thank you to you both. This is super great. Again, such a good example of things young people can do. I'll say polar bears are very cool. I'm very lucky to be able to have a job where I get to do what I do. But I'll also say it's polar bear season right now. So mid-October to mid-November. You can check out the polar bear cams on explore.org if you want to watch live polar bears. I'll be in Churchill pretty soon, and we'll be looking at polar bears every day and spreading the love and celebrating how funny and cool they are. So you can check us out there, or our website, polarbearsinternational.org, has all sorts of information, including ways that young people can get involved and put pressure on their schools and things like that. And I just want to say thank you to you both. This has been a lot of fun.
Thank you so much.
much. Listeners, we hope you enjoyed our episode.
Please comment, subscribe, and give us feedback.
If you have an animal or a habitat you would like us to make an episode about, please email us at dotpotatosisters@gmail.com.
Also, make sure to check out our Instagram, which is @dotpotatosisters.
Bye!